programs. You're in Red Pill Sunday School. It is Sunday the 10th of December, 2000, and welcome. You're tuned in to UCY.TV. Want to give a special shout out to Jules and her husband for all of their incredible time that they put into this station to make it run, all the work they do themselves. It's fantastic. Please do support them. Give them your thanks at least. Send them a note. Say how much you appreciate. I want to get right into it today. I'm your host, Clint. You might know me from such things as the Corporation Nation, thecorporationnation.com, from my blog at realityblogger.wordpress.com, and from my new site and book, which is strawmanstory.info. That's strawmanstory.info, where you can download my almost 1,200-page book for free. It will always be free. And if you'd like a copy of that, well, read the website. Just ask for a donation, and I'll send you a free copy. And if you can't afford, as I know a lot of people are already disenfranchised out there, and when I say enfranchised or disenfranchised, I truly actually mean that, because that's the definition of freedom in this country, is to be enfranchised. When the slaves were released, they were enfranchised into the corporation. It was, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, how that 14th Amendment was set up for Negroes and yet left open for all of us, everyone else, all the indentured servants who were white, of course, you can't enslave white people according to the founding fathers, those great men who, I don't know why they're great, but apparently they're still worshipped as gods in this country. Yeah, so it was okay to enslave the black population, but not, or I should say the Negro or tainted blood specifically, but not, of course, white persons. So, yeah, that is how this country was formed. You can't get around it. It's in the Constitution. Yeah. and they were generous enough for tax purposes to call a slave 3/5 a person. You just can't get around this. Now, what I want to start off today is to give you a true history here that I've never actually heard before. I came upon this a while ago, and I've never actually talked about it. But I wanted to start off the show today with this, so that we know the mood, if you will, that was happening, which led to the quote-unquote Civil War. Now, before we go into the Civil War and what it was, I want you to understand this was not a war, folks. We call it the Civil War. We put titles on things that have nothing to do with what they actually are. There was no war declared, because Congress, as it was dissolved the second those states stepped outside it. In other words, the quote-unquote states who formed a confederacy means, by definition, a conspiracy, by the way, and we have Articles of Confederation for this country, which was a conspiracy against the king, to take the lands of the king and create a new nation, a new country. So this is exactly what happened to the Confederate States. The United States, and I'll prove this to you if you just keep listening, did not ever recognize the Confederacy as a separate government, even though it set itself up that way, and should have been recognized by the quote-unquote law of nations. The international law should have been recognized as a separate nation, fighting for its own independence, just as the United States. But we had a rogue government. We had Lincoln as president. Lincoln was not the great guy you think he was. He's portrayed in such a light that is so different than reality, than history as it's written. And again, I'm not going to comment on his top hat or say that there was some apple that fell on someone's head and gave them an idea, all of these stupid historical things. I'm not going to tell you that I loved the founding fathers or the presidents. No, I'm telling you what is written, what is actual history. And the only actual history is what these people, again, left us in their writings, in their laws, to inherit. So that is what we're talking about. And I want to be clear here that there was no civil war. A war would be between two nations. A war would be something declared. The last war that we had that was so-called legitimate, if you can even call it that, was declared by Congress, and that was World War II, folks. We have not been to any war. There was no Gulf War. There was no war in Vietnam. There was simply a massive, power-hungry, oil-hungry, opium-hungry country, nation, called the United States, that went in as the military arm of the other three city-state nations, which you all know about, the Vatican and the City of London. The strong arm of those three went in and over the course of the last 50, 60 years has occupied just about every country at this point. There are military bases now in just about every country for the U.S., and we say Russia's the bad guy, which I think they occupy 3 or maybe 5 countries with their military. But we occupy the world. I'm not going to say we anymore. I don't consider myself a part of that. Even though I've got the mark, I've got the blemish, I've got the sign, I've got the persona. As much as I hate to say that, I am a silent partner. I have to say that. I have to say that I'm a quote-unquote sinner. I am a citizenship of the United Nations, or at least I'm acting in that part. I can't deny that, and I cannot deny that that means it's my fault, and it means it's your fault. Every single person or man who's acting in persona, it's your fault too. All of this death and destruction, it's all of our faults. You cannot blame a demonic entity for doing demonic things if you give it the power to do it. And that's what we do. That's what we do by our silence and by enjoying all the benefits that we receive while millions and billions of people suffer around the world so that we can have our HGTV. Now, what can I say here? Let's start with the mood before the Civil War. There was always contention about slavery. There's plenty of quotes that I could read, which I will not today, about slavery, asking why is it that, especially talking about the Founding Fathers and the landholders, the private landholders who did have slaves, about that they were the biggest whiners about liberty. Slaveholders crying from the top of their lungs that they wanted liberty to hold their slaves separate from the king. Wow, that's pretty pathetic. You want liberty? It was Douglas who said that no man can be free unless all men are free. Douglas was a black gentleman of high ranking in society. So let's hear a couple of quotes from good President Lincoln, first of all. Lincoln, being seventh cousin, 7th time removed with Barack Obama. Of course, he's related to all presidents. Of course, it's incestuous. Here is the true Abraham Lincoln, like we, of course, never heard. I'm going to read these from my book. These were actually posted. I think I got these from the Cato Institute with references. Executive order by the President Lincoln, May 18th, 64. See, an executive order is how the quote-unquote Civil War, the war of northern aggression, as they call it down there, actually happened. And it was not about slavery in any shape or form, which you'll understand at the end of this. First thing that President Lincoln did, talking about freedom of the press, You will take possession by military force of the printing establishments of the New York World and Journal of Commerce, and prohibit any further publication thereof. You are therefore commanded forthwith to arrest and imprison the editors, proprietors, and publishers of the aforementioned newspapers. Now, I want you to know, folks, that can happen to any of you, any newspaper, anything out there at all. That can happen. That could happen to Russia today very simply, very easily, just a simple executive order. And this is why they don't report anything real. Can you imagine if the news actually reported news, real news? They'd be shut down. They're just like they were before or during the Civil War. Okay, let's go. Here's his inaugural address from 1860, the part that they don't ever read. I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and indeed he did not. And I have no inclination to do so. This was something protected by the Constitution. From a letter to Horace Greeley, dated August 22nd, 1892, he says, my paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. Now, when he says save the Union, he's basically saying that these states have no right to secede, excuse me. In other words, by seceding, they're taking federal lands, essentially, just like when the United States seceded from the king and their war, the quote-unquote war ensued. It wasn't really a war because those, again, the king did not declare or say that those lands could be separated. It wasn't a war. It was a declaration of aggression by the king. There was no war. We call it the Revolutionary War. Well, there was no war. There was the same exact thing. A king, i.e. president, a supreme leader, a ruler declaring that what is happening is not in favor of the kingdom. The Union, kingdom, union, same thing. He says, my paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. Now, that is no different, folks, than any corporate CEO or board of directors talking about a bunch of employees, 1 million employees being fired because they have to reorganize the corporation. Okay, this is not any different than that. There's no heart, there's no soul, there's no care whatsoever. This is strictly a business decision. I am not, he says, in 1858, this is quoted from the Cato Institute, Lincoln's Secession and Slavery is the title. I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. There is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. Oh, did you hear what Clint said? No, that was President Lincoln. You have to understand, folks, this country, this nation, was set up for quote unquote white persons. You have to understand the disposition of these men when they make their quotes. You cannot just take these quotes arbitrarily and have an opinion. You have to always consider the source. Here's a guy who is president, and his whole purpose is to keep the white persons, i.e. the bloodline of the kings, who are all related to each other, all of them. This is why they say in the Civil War it was brother fighting brother, cousin fighting cousin, white fighting white. You have to understand this. You can't look at it any other way. You can't start pulling the race card. You can't. No, 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 no. Look at it for what it was. A corporation set up for a specific family and their posterity. A plantation, a farm, a colony, a literal corporation set up to benefit only this family, no different in any way, shape, or form than that which was set up by the kings and queens of England, etc., France, everywhere else. We have to put ourselves into that time period. We have to forget all the stuff that's happened since. We cannot simply call it racism. We actually are. I mean, I don't know how to say it. Racism wasn't a thing. There was no racism. There was clearly a divide, as he says, between black or Negro blood and white blood. If you can't put yourself into that position and put yourself back into history, then you're never going to understand what happened. And you're certainly not going to understand what's happening today. George Mason, one of the Virginia delegates in 1787, of course, was a staunch opponent to slavery. He says slavery discourages arts and manufacturing. Every master of slaves is born a petty tyrant. James Madison, this was the quote I was thinking of earlier, 1787, says, "We have seen the mere distinction of color made in the most enlightened period of time a ground of the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man." And 1787, Eldridge Geary from Massachusetts delegate, he said, "I am exceedingly distressed at the proceedings of the convention, being almost sure they will lay the foundation of a civil war." Why? Because they kept slavery. Now, let's fast forward, okay? We're going back, we're going to now the 1860s, around the 1860s, and what has built up since then. There's so much I could read about this to make you clear, but it's just going to take too much time to go through all of the states actually that were in the Confederacy wrote up the reasons, almost like a Declaration of Independence for each one of them, the reasons why they were separating from the Union. Let me give you an example. Here's Mississippi. Mississippi wrote this, the Declaration of Causes of Seceding States. All right, this is from civilwar.org. By the way, Mississippi says it says a declaration of the immediate causes which induce and justify the secession of the state of Mississippi from the federal union. In the momentous step which our state has taken of dissolving its connection with a government of which we so long formed a part, it is but just that we should declare the prominent reasons which have induced our course. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. Now, again, please don't say that I'm for or against anything here. I'm reading history, period. Just stop hating the messenger. It's labor supplies, the products which constitute by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. Slavery, that is. These products are peculiar to the climate verging on the tropic regions, and by an imperious law of nature, none but the black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. Oh, that's why they created sunscreen for all of us slaves. These products have become necessities of the world, products being slaves. And a blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. That blow has been long aimed at the institution and was at the point of reaching its consummation. There was no choice left us but submission to the mandates of abolition or a dissolution of the Union, whose principles have been subverted to work out our ruin. That we do not overstate the dangers to our institution, a reference to a few facts will sufficiently prove. Now, I want you to understand what they're saying here. This was a conspiracy by the northern states, the federal government, the federal union, to end slavery. This was a conspiracy against slavery. All right. The hostility to this institution commenced before the adoption of the Constitution and was manifested in the well-known Ordinance of 1787 in regard to the Northwest Territory. The feeling increased until in 1819 to 20 it deprived the South of more than half the vast territory acquired from France. Remember, we talked about the federal government taking lands, unappropriated lands, public lands. The same hostility dismembered Texas and seized upon the territory acquired from Mexico. It has grown until it denies the right of property in slaves and refuses protection to that right on the high seas, in the territories, and wherever the government of the United States has jurisdiction. So it claims jurisdiction in the state and then outlaws slavery. But remember, what they are saying, and you have to empathize with evil here to understand this. They're saying we are supposed to be protected by the United States in our right to own these products, i.e. slaves. No, it's not a good thing. It's history. It's the real history. This is the attitude at the time. So let me be clear here. In other words, the United States is not upholding its constitutional requirements, if that makes sense. It's supposed to be protecting the right, these horrible people's rights to own slaves. It refuses the admission of new slave states into the Union and seeks to extinguish it by confining it within its present limits, denying the power of expansion. Now, I gotta say, this is, I don't mean to offend, but this doesn't sound too much unlike Mexicans. They're trying to basically legalize or enfranchise Mexicans who are undocumented. Well, slaves were undocumented, just like the Mexicans work in the fields today. There's not really much difference from what you're seeing today and what you were seeing before the Civil War. And I think this is why people are afraid that we're going to go into a civil war if we allow this to happen. Same thing as what suddenly all these farmers out there who are hiring illegals, all those illegals that are sitting in front of home, suddenly you're going to have to pay them minimum wage. Suddenly they're going to have the ship. They're going to be property of the United States in their personas. They're going to be able to say, no, you've got to give me minimum wage. You can't pay me $2 an hour anymore. You see, it's not any different. It's just that we don't consider today's crop sharers, today's plantation holders, today's agricultural farmers, we don't consider them as slaveholders because they just don't call it slavery. It's the same thing. They don't call it slavery. It's wage slavery, if you will. But if they suddenly had the protection, the rights of U.S. citizenship, well, God, then they could demand poverty level minimum wage. Oh, what a wonderful thing. God, things are so messed up. It tramples the original equality of the South underfoot. In other words, the notion of equal footing. It has nullified the fugitive slave law in almost every free state in the Union, and has utterly broken the compact which our fathers pledged their faith to maintain. Again, see, that's the most important part. Our founding fathers pledged their faith to maintain slavery. Quit celebrating them. It's disgusting. This state, Mississippi, is now complaining that the free states nullified the laws that said if a slave escapes, it has to be returned. It's like cattle. Oh, look, there's a brand on this cattle. I can't take it. I have to return it to its owner. Oh, no, that cattle went to a free state. Doesn't matter what brand is on it. See, that's what they're angry about. If a slave can escape through the underground and reach a free frickin' state, they can't be returned. It's disgusting. But this was the mindset. And so you have to understand the mindset. It advocates Negro equality. Oh, by God. Equality with whites and Negroes, socially and politically, and promotes insurrection and incendiarism in our midst. It has enlisted its press, its pulpit, and its schools against us until the whole popular mind of the North is excited and inflamed with prejudice. And I say again, that's what's happening now with the illegal immigrant issue that we have. It's really not that different. And it is exciting a different type of prejudice, I believe, on both sides. It has made combinations, i.e. conspiracies or confederations, and formed associations to carry out its schemes of emancipation in the states and wherever slavery exists. It seeks not to elevate or support the slave, but to destroy his present condition without providing a better. Now, suddenly, Mississippi is making sense. It seeks not to elevate or support the slave, but to destroy his present condition without providing a better. Now, I know that the Jews in Hollywood have always told you that slaves were treated absolutely horrifically. And sometimes, in some cases, that would be true. Sometimes, though, that's not the case. In fact, I would probably say the majority of the time, if you think logically and reasonably about it, it makes no sense that you would treat your slaves poorly so that they're too injured or weak to work the fields. Now, again, I'm just being analytical here. But it doesn't really make sense, the Hollywood version, does it? It doesn't really make sense that you would treat your slaves poorly as portrayed by that Hollywood group. So I want you to consider that for a moment, because here they're making sense. Because, you know, again, if you're gonna take away slavery, or the status, if you will, or the anti-status of slavery, and you're not going to give anything that makes it better, all you're going to do is basically make them illegals, is what it's saying. And remember, this is before the 14th Amendment. This is before they were given or enfranchised into the corporation as corporate subjects. They didn't propose a 14th Amendment. They didn't propose citizenship. So they're saying, listen, you're going to take away what little advantage they do have as slaves, their shelter and their food, their fed, and you're not going to give them anything. So for once, Mississippi actually, you know, that actually makes sense when you think about it. Doesn't make it right, again, but it has invaded a state and invested with the honors of martyrdom the wretch whose purpose was to apply flames to our dwellings and the weapons of destruction to our lives. Here we're talking about carpetbaggers, etc. It has broken every compact into which it has entered for our security. Again, talking about the Constitution and the Founding Fathers. It has given indubitable evidence of its design and ruin on our agriculture, to prostrate our industrial pursuits, and to destroy our social system. Now, I want you to think about that for a moment. Think about right now the subsidies that are necessary in order for farms, modern day agricultural, huge farms, to exist. They sell their lettuce at $3 a head, and it costs them $4 or $5 a head to grow because they don't have slaves. They have to pay. So again, going into the mindset, maybe we can understand why our agricultural system is so fucked up. Why we have to have these types of subsidies, because there's no slavery. It's a system that was built, literally an idea that was built on slavery, the idea of free, quote-unquote, labor, that no longer exists, and yet you were using the same model without slaves. It doesn't really make sense. You see, that's why it's so expensive. Now, again, not my opinion, just this is a breakdown of why society is so messed up, because it still does things in the same way it did when there was slaves, which doesn't make sense. It knows no relenting or hesitation in its purposes. It stops not in its march of aggression and leaves us no room to hope for cessation of pause. It has recently obtained control of the government by the prosecution of its unhallowed schemes, which if you haven't listened to my previous shows, we talked about how this scheme was created, how the United States was created, how it was put into the corporation, Washington, D.C., a foreign thing, foreign entity. This is the scheming they're talking about. Let me read that again. It has recently obtained control of the government. Do you hear that, folks? This is a state saying that it has recently obtained control of the government by the procession of its unhallowed schemes and destroyed the last expectation of living together in friendship and brotherhood. Utter subjection awaits us in the Union if we should consent longer to remain in it. It is not a matter of choice, but of necessity. We must either submit to degradation and to the loss of property worth $4 billion of money, referring to the state lands that the federal government started taking, or we must secede from the Union framed by our fathers to secure this as well as every other species of property. For far less cause than this, our fathers separated from the crown of England. Our decision is made. We follow their footsteps. We embrace the alternative of separation. And for the reasons here stated, we resolve to maintain our rights with the full consciousness of the justice of our course and the undoubting belief of our ability to maintain it. I submit to you, folks, that this declaration is no different than what it was at the very inception of the United States. Exactly what the founding fathers, in fact, I would say this reminds me of the Mormon Church. When the Mormon Church was told by government that your president, your leader, has to have a revelation from God that says polygamy is no longer lawful, all of a sudden the church declared that God has declared through the prophet, through the president, that polygamy is no longer lawful and that the state of Utah will no longer have polygamy. It went into law, and the church broke shortly after. Guess what, folks? The church that is the real church, not the corporation of the president, which we call the Mormon Church, but the church itself broke off and became, I don't know what it's called. It's been in the news. It's where you see all the polygamy, etc. in Utah. Two branches of the Mormon Church. They broke off. Which one, I ask you, was the legitimate one? Which one was actually going by its founding principles? Yeah, you see, that's the alternative. But the mainstream one, of course, was just like the federal corporation. It had all the power. It had all the political power, the money. This separate church, which I'm sorry I can't remember the name of it, but that's the original church. Just like this, Mississippi is remaining just as it was originally, according to the Constitution, according to the quote-unquote founding fathers. I don't know how to say this, but who's the bad guy? Now, I say that, of course, again, going back to the time and the mindset of the time. Who's the bad guy? Obviously, the federal corporation that they set up, as we talked about in previous shows, is the bad guy. Lincoln is the head of that corporation, the quote-unquote union. Who was in the right? South Carolina was in the right. Mississippi was in the right. Now, when I say right, again, I want you to understand the time period. What was the union, the federal union, so the federal government supposed to support and protect? The right to hold men as property, i.e. slaves. Not right or wrong, just the way it was. So the question becomes, getting back on the subject, the question becomes, was the Civil War actually about slavery? you just heard a lot of extra stuff going on. There was obviously a lot of espionage, if you will, a lot of underhanded things happening. The lands were being taken from the states and put under federal jurisdiction, as the Constitution says can happen. Now let's pause here and let's go to the real 13th Amendment. What would have been the 13th Amendment? Okay, 13th Amendment was passed in, I believe it was 1865, if I'm not mistaken. But what happened in 1861? Now, I'm on archives.gov. So this is a government website. And this is the page is called the 213th Amendment. Now I can click on joint resolution proposing a 13th Amendment to the Constitution in the National Archives, General Records of the U.S. Government. Here is what it says. I can't read that, so I'm going to go to the transcript. Public 7 Resolution 36 Congress of the United States at the second session, begun and held in the city of Washington in the District of Columbia on Monday, the 3rd day of December, 1860. Joint resolution to amend the Constitution of the United States, resolved by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled that the following article be proposed to the legislatures of the several states as amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which were ratified by 3/4 of said legislatures, which were ratified by 3/4 of said legislatures shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of the said Constitution, vis-a-vis Article 12. Which would have been the 13th Amendment. Remember, amendments are actually articles. So look up the word article, you understand what an amendment is. No amendment. This is what the 13th Amendment would have been if this had been passed, and it was barely not passed. No amendment, quote, no amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of said state. In other words, Congress cannot abolish or interfere with indentured servitude or slavery. That is the original resolution that would have become the 13th Amendment. What is the 13th Amendment? The 13th Amendment, as it stands, is a very deceiving amendment, which we'll get into. But this, to be clear, no amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of said state. This was the 13th Amendment. This is like an alternative history line that could have been. You know, this could have been our history. We might be a population that grew up in public school with only white kids, where the black kids were in their own schools. Segregation never would have stopped. The civil rights movement never would have happened if this amendment would have been passed, and it barely did not pass. We would have grown up. You and me would have grown up. If you're black, you'd be a slave. I want you to think about that for a moment. You know, you have Philip K. Dick wrote a really cool science fiction story about if Hitler would have triumphed in the World War II. Well, I want you to think if slavery would have triumphed in the United States, and by all practical purposes, it should have. I hate to tell you this because this is a white person nation. That is how this country was set up for them and their posterity. You just can't get around that. I say that with a heavy heart, believe me. I don't consider myself a white person because I'm not a person. There's no such thing as persons. Person is a status. White just means blood. It means that you're a blood relation of these psychopathic people who've been ruling every country and every nation for how long now? I mean, I just really want you to get this, folks. Do you understand that this could have very, very easily could have been our history? I mean, I want you to imagine that. I say that for the black folks out there too, the colored, the Negro. I want you to consider that you could be slaves today. Let's just keep going. Maybe this will be clear. This was approved March 2nd, 1861 by James Buchanan, William Pennington, Speaker of the House of Representatives, John C. Breckinridge, Vice President of the United States, and the President of the Senate. So there you go. To me, that this is just incredible history that I never was taught. Now, a while ago, in the Washington Post, its catchline is "Democracy dies in darkness." Give me a break. Actually, it says, this is the title, actually, John Kelly, the failed compromise to avoid civil war would have enshrined slavery. So this is actually being reported in the news lately, which I find interesting. This was John Kelly and Laura Ingstrom, I think is her name, from Fox News. It says that White House Chief of Staff John F. Kelly, whose boss is well known for unique opinions about the Civil War, in other words, more true ones, more accurate ones, introduced his own hypothesis to the world last night when he blamed the war on the lack of an ability to compromise. The Washington Post has already written about what historians think of Kelly's thoughts, their assessments ranging from dangerous to kind of depressing, which truth often is. But the truth is, the panicky months before the Civil War were full of attempts to compromise with the rebellious South. The most popular proposal by far was a constitutional amendment, which we just read, that would have irreversibly immortalized slavery as a feature of the United States. And although supporters of this compromise, up to and including Abraham Lincoln, the most of Congress, did fail to pull it off, it wasn't for lack of trying. The central difficulty of bargaining with secessionists, as Daniel W. Crofts writes in Lincoln and the Politics of Slavery, is that so many secessionists were hysterical. White Southerners had heard endlessly that black Republicans planned to destroy slavery and confer equal citizen rights on ex-slaves. The College of New Jersey's Emeritus history professor writes in his book. So when Lincoln was elected as the first Republican president in the late 1860, an extensive mass panic followed. The government is in the hands of those who are unfriendly to slavery, a U.S. senator from Georgia warned Congress the next month, for example. He proposed not just abolition, but slave uprisings, murderings, poisonings, and revolts under Lincoln's reign. Hey, that sounds like La Raza and what they're telling Mexicans to do and whatever these other gangs are, doesn't it? Again, the parallels I think are very important here to realize. Murderers, poisonings, revolts, Soros-funded ones, which was absolute garbage, Crofts told the Washington Post. Lincoln hated slavery, the professor said, but the incoming president had no desire to upend the Southern slave economy, lest he fracture his young party or risk a war. God forbid the party should fall. Nevertheless, fear spread, and as southern states started to secede, Unionists in the North urged Lincoln to compromise. Petitions descended on Washington from Boston, New York City, and Philadelphia. The largest daily newspaper in the world, the New York Herald, implored Lincoln to strike a Union compromise, which would put an end to the notion that his party wanted to exterminate the white race in the South and let the Negro free, unquote. Lincoln, it turned out, was amenable. While fantasies of freed slaves running rampant drove politics in the South in 1860, policymakers in Washington debated a relatively narrow issue: whether to allow slavery on the U.S. frontiers. Quote, the right to take slaves to the territories was a defining symbol of Southern equality in the Union, Crofts writes, but Republicans, Lincoln included, drew their line here. They would condone slavery where it existed, but not allow its expansion. Thurlow Weed, the politically connected editor of Albany's Evening Journal, spent the end of 1860 publishing essays that Crofts calls trial balloons for his friends in Washington to test whether Lincoln might be open to compromise on the frontier slavery issues. Quote, our fathers found slavery so deeply seated that they could not form a union without recognizing and tolerating it. Now, again, our founding fathers, quote unquote, found slavery so deeply seated that they could not form a union without recognizing and tolerating it. And you can read those debates when the Constitution was being formed. Weed wrote in mid-December, according to Crofts, he advocated a widely circulated plan called the Crittenden Compromise, which would allow slavery in new Southern territories only. Weed published this essay and then hopped on a train to Springfield, Illinois, to ask President-elect Lincoln what he thought of the idea. Lincoln didn't think much of it, Crofts writes. He would, quote, he would not bend an inch toward them on the territories. But the historian cites evidence that Lincoln offered Weed a different sort of compromise in that meeting. It's in a December 26 letter to Lincoln from Senator William Henry Seward of New York, a high-ranking member of the Republican Party, with whom Weed often conspired. Seward had been working with other senators to head off the South's secession movement. He told the president-elect that his committee's proposal was modeled off, quote, the suggestions made by you through Mr. Weed as I understand it, unquote. The first proposal, quote, that the Constitution should never be altered so as to authorize Congress to abolish or interfere with slavery in the states. So obviously Lincoln was opposed to this particular amendment, which we spoke about in 1961. However, just as the Founding Fathers found themselves in this predicament because slavery was so deep-seated, all Lincoln wanted to do was preserve the Union. What does that mean? That means militarily force those states who tried to secede to, under military pressure and death and destruction, stay in the Union, pledge their lands to the United States in their bankruptcies, etc. Seward drafted a constitutional amendment that same week, which can now be seen at the National Archives, and that's the one we just read. It's short, written in immaculate cursive, and signed by outgoing President James Buchanan. And as Croft notes, the word slavery does not appear on it even once. But slaves were exactly what was meant. The amendment would have assuaged slave owners' fears for forever forbidding the federal government from freeing them. It would be a formula for reuniting the country politically, Croft said, aimed not so much at hardcore secessionists in the Deep South, but to convince people in border states, such as Virginia, that Lincoln had no designs on their slaves. What is he saying here? He's saying that if you took away the possibility that you could get rid of slavery in these southern states, if the constitutional amendment was made, then the whole thing would have dissolved itself. Slavery would have stayed, it would have remained, and there would be no quote-unquote Civil War. That's a really, pardon my French, but that's a really fucked up way of looking at things, but it's also a very true way of looking at things because, of course, then you had nothing to fight for. If the Constitution protects slavery, you can't really get around that. There's no law you can pass, etc. in the state. So, yeah, again, not right or wrong, just stating the facts here. Lincoln's fingerprints are on this thing, Crofts told the Post. Not only did he probably suggest its creation, but he also spent the days leading up to his inauguration trying to rally Congress behind it. The Slavery Amendment It would have been the 13th Amendment, divided Congress almost as soon as it was introduced, of course. Quote, a mass of humanity jammed the hallways, unquote, of the Senate building in January to hear Seward pitch his plan. 2 days later, Representative Tom Corwin of Ohio reported on his House committee's version of the amendment, which his fellow Republicans refused to support. 2 congressmen condemned the bill as a constitutional decree of perpetual bondage. That was going to be the 3 Republicans that no vote for compromise was to sow on the soil now free the seeds of whips, chains, theft, robbery, and murder. Corwin despaired of ever passing the amendment through Congress, let alone of then persuading state legislators to ratify it. The congressman warned Lincoln that a long and bloody civil wallow if they failed. If you don't make these damn Negroes into permanent slaves, we're going to have a long and bloody civil war. That's wow. And so, less than 2 weeks before his inauguration, just after dawn of February 23rd, 1861, Lincoln arrived by train in Washington and gave the bill a very powerful push. So bad was secession fervor by then that Lincoln traveled incognito, Croft writes, lest assassins kill him on the way. Oh, but it was such a surprise that he was assassinated. Oh. On his second day in Washington, Lincoln met privately with the Slavery Amendment's House champion Corwin and gave him the go-ahead to initiate a vote. The next week, now, you can't blame him in that way for that. He's the president. It's not like he can stop Congress from voting. It's like you can't look at it any other way. Again, got to save the Union. Got to save the corporation. Got to make the corporation work. The next week was filled with chaotic late-night sessions and nail-biter votes in both the House and the Senate. Croft cites newspaper reports of insider political gossip to argue that Lincoln undoubtedly worked behind the scenes to get the amendment passed. The historian even signs that some kind of quid pro quo might have won several last-minute votes for the bill, which needed a 2/3 majority in each chamber. Take Senator Lot M. Morrill of Maine, who complained aloud that the amendment would change the whole spirit of the Constitution, then inexplicitly came out in support of it hours later, as we see happen all the time in Congress today. Oh, shit. Oh. Or Thomas Theaker, a lame duck congressman who withheld his vote on February 27th, then voted for the bill in a redo the very next day, and subsequently just happened to be appointed to a U.S. Patent Office board. How nice for him. Oh, the graft. It's just so wonderful. Whatever happened, it worked. A cheering crowd and a Marine band marched to Lincoln's Hotel after the House passed the amendment on February 28th. Now, again, your House of Representatives passed this amendment, folks. Passed perpetual servitude and slavery. They passed it. Quote, the president-elect responded graciously by promising to overcome all current misunderstanding, unquote. A few days later, after an extraordinary session that lasted nearly the entire weekend, the Senate passed the amendment by a single vote. A single vote, the Senate passed the bill at 5:20 a.m. on Monday. Are you hearing this, folks? This is history. This is what would have happened if the United States Congress actually stayed together and wasn't abandoned, which led to what we're going to be talking about next, which is the presidential declarations and executive orders, which led to the quote-unquote Civil War, which was nothing more than a corporate military aggression to quote-unquote preserve the Union. Preserve the contract, preserve the compact. This was a contract war. So, wow, folks, the House and the Senate voted and approved this bill. You got that? This is how close we were to a Philip K. Dick-esque story and history where we would still be celebrating slavery today. This was the mindset of the time. I want you to understand that. 8 hours later, the new president of the United States stood in front of the U.S. Capitol, took an oath, and gave his inaugural address to a disintegrating nation. Now, that inaugural address is where I read that quote from before. I have no interest in, anything to do with slavery. Again, the Civil War really wasn't about slavery in the way we're taught. Quote, I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists, Lincoln promised in his opening lines. 8 hours later, after this bill of perpetual slavery was passed. And towards the end, in the passage was slipped in, quote, I understand a proposed amendment, this is Lincoln speaking, I understand a proposed amendment to the Constitution, which amendment, however, I have not seen, has passed Congress. Yeah, I believe that. Lincoln quoted the resolution's text, slavery everlasting, if not in so many words, and gave this endorsement to the crowd, quote, holding such a provision to now be implied constitutional law, I have no objection to its being made express and irrevocable. Okay, so here you have the three necessary persons, the necessary offices, the necessary Congress, the Senate, the House, and the President. They're all in agreement to pass the 13th Amendment, a proposition for the 13th Amendment for perpetual slavery. Slavery everlasting, as he basically said. That is how close we came to perpetual slavery. And you got to ask yourself, why then was the South going to secede? Obviously, way more was going on than just this. This was all about compromise, right? So it might have been irrevocable had not a war come first. So while this was happening, the seed was sprouting. The war was beginning. Lincoln and Seward, who had drafted the amendment as a senator and was now the Secretary of State, sent its text to the governors of every state in the splintering union to await ratification by their legislatures. The newspapers sounded optimistic for a while. The Louisville Journal wrote that the compromise will go far towards satisfying the South. But obviously, the South had way more conflicts, as we read. But the conflict was already spiraling out of control, and Lincoln's attention was soon diverted to a crisis at Fort Sumter, where the Civil War was launched in April. Kentucky had managed to ratify the slavery amendment by then, so one state had already ratified it. Ohio and Rhode Island would do so in the bloody weeks to follow, but it was too late. Quote, because the amendment was designed to prevent a war, it became irrelevant once the war broke out. Now, I want you to remember, folks, war or a declaration by the president, an executive order by the president, that means that the Constitution is suspended. That means that no law exists. There is no law in war. War follows the doctrine of necessity. Necessity knows no law. That is a maxim of law. So once the war started, it didn't matter what was in the Constitution. It's gone. We're now in the military, the executive takes over, the executive of the corporation, the president takes over, and it's a military. It's military law at that point. And that's where the Lieber Code and all of that stuff comes from. Which, again, we'll get to. Before long, Northerners who never could imagine using armed force against the slave system found that war forced them to do just that. The Civil War made real what had been a secessionist fantasy weeks earlier. It turned Republicans into abolitionists. And in the final year of the war, the South nearly defeated. Lincoln pushed for a very different 13th Amendment than the one he first endorsed. This one was ratified and it abolished slavery forever, the antithesis of the abandoned compromise. Now, of course, you're not going to hear about the real 13th Amendment from this guy. You're not going to report about what the real 13th Amendment, which was the enfranchisement of all slaves into the United States. They did not end slavery. They took the slaves and they made them free. This is the definition of emancipation. To free something, that in legal terms means to enfranchise, to give rights within the corporate jurisdiction. That is what U.S. citizenship is. It was left open, although it was only for Negroes in the beginning. These who no longer had the rights, if you will, I don't want to say the rights of a slave, but at least the protections of the slave owners and the shelter, etc. All of a sudden, these slaves had no work, no job, no nothing. They were just thrown out in the street because there could be no more slavery. So now they have this United States property that they carry around called a person, called a citizenship. They're thrown into the law of the sea, have no constitutional rights, have no right to own land, have no right to do anything. They're in this mid-state of exactly what we are all today because we've been thrown into the birth certificate process, which is, again, the same contractual enfranchisement freedom that every slave got. And that's why Horace Greeley was very clear when he said, quote, "We have stricken the slave shackles from 4 million human beings and brought all laborers to a common level, not so much by the elevation of former slaves, but by practically reducing the whole working population, white and black, to a condition of serfdom, while boasting of our noble deeds." As slaveholders, former slaveholders, we are careful to conceal the ugly fact that by an iniquitous money system we have nationalized a system of oppression which, though more refined, is not less cruel than the old system of chattel slavery. Folks, he's talking about us, those of us who have been put into the birth certificate process, making us the same exact status as the slaves that were enfranchised into the United States. That's all of us, folks. We're all in this together. And that's what I'm trying to say. We've all been essentially lowered to that status. This is how we are equal. This is why we have equal rights. The equal right to be put in pain, punished, taxed, licensed, and extorted, just like slaves. But we're free. We're free. You fools. And so it's safe to say, really, that there was a perpetual form of slavery. It's called volunteerism. Because remember, what does the 13th Amendment say, folks? And the next show that we do, I'm going to cover this in more detail, because this goes back to the sort of satanic version, if you will, of natural law, which so many people believe is the true law of nature, but it's not. I'll just leave that for next week, because remember, the state constitutions say your rights are inalienable, meaning they're for sale, and therefore the 13th Amendment is essentially says, hey, if you sell your natural rights, you can become a citizen of the United States. What does the 13th Amendment say? It says, quote, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, wherever the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." Remember, the states are subject to their jurisdiction, so that's everywhere. Formally abolishing slavery in the United States passed January 31st, 1865, ratified by the states December 6, 1865. So, what does this say, folks? I want you to, so you got to reword these things sometimes to understand what they're saying. If I were to reword this so that you understand exactly what it says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime, where the party shall be duly convicted shall exist in the United States or any place subject to the jurisdiction. Okay, let's reword that. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude. Okay, so here's what it really says. It says, let's scratch out the neither. Okay, it says slavery or involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to its jurisdiction if or as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall be duly convicted. See, when you reword it like that, oh, okay, so we're not abolishing slavery. We're saying we can use slavery, and slavery is just fine as long as it's voluntary. See, it doesn't say voluntary slavery is outlawed. It says involuntary. Are you getting this? Volunteerism, which is what we are as citizens in this debt slavery system, debt servitude, that's what it says. And by your parents putting you into the birth certificate process, you have to read my book because this is hard to explain, but it is a crime. You are a criminal. You're a waif. You're being put into nativity, which means prison in the legal sense. You're being convicted when you call the United States your father. You're operating as property of the United States. This is voluntary servitude, folks. Therefore, the 13th Amendment did not abolish slavery. It abolished involuntary slavery and said, but that's just in the States. If you want to be slaves of the United States, yeah, go ahead, volunteer. Just, operate in the person. Take the surname, take the mark, take the number, get your benefits, start using them, and you're now considered as expressing and confirming and ratifying the contractual relationship. And therefore, the contract makes the law. You have no rights. You've sold your rights. And that's what we're going to be talking about next show, is that inalienable as opposed to unalienable rights. Unalienable means can't be sold. Inalienable means can be sold. And we'll cover that next week. But it's very important to understand that, because if government recognized our God-given rights as unalienable, then none of this could happen. There could be no U.S. citizenship if we were recognized as having unalienable rights. Instead, every state in the Union, in its Constitution, says we have inalienable rights. We can sell our rights. We can sell, just like Esau sold his inheritance for a loaf of bread or a slice of bread. We can sell ours too, and we have. The problem is we never knew we did it because our parents did it for us and their parents did it for them. Nobody knew. Nobody understood this was happening. Well, I won't say nobody. Obviously, we know who does understand. The landholders, the private people. Anyway. Okay, so now we understand the theme, we understand the attitude, we understand the disposition of the South compared to the disposition of the North, the states, that is. So we understand that there was a whole lot of stuff besides slavery going on. But I do want you to understand, it's so important to understand that we're all slaves at this point. It's just a different form. You don't think of it as slavery because, wage slavery is not something, because we're called free, which means franchise. You don't think of yourself as being enslaved or being, under this contractual situation, but you are. And again, as Horace Greeley stated, the whites and the Negroes were put into equality. That means the whites were lowered to the level of that. And that means that, well, yes, you could say that Negroes were raised in a very screwed up sense to become slaves of the United States instead of the states, the private landholders. If all of us, if all of the white folks and every other race and color and creed were also put into that, well, then we've all been lowered to the level of slave. And that's hard for most people to take, I know. The truth, the spiritual awakening that we must go through is not going to be something pleasant. See, I think people think spiritual awakening is something that's great and wonderful and pleasant. It's the hardest thing you'll ever go through. It's so disturbing to find out the truth. But once you see it, once you have it, then it becomes a beautiful thing, because then you know what's happening. You know that you can get out of it. But you know also that it's not going to happen unless many, many others awake from this. It does me no good to have the knowledge without sharing it with you, and then you sharing it with others. And God, I hope you people are sharing this show, my book, etc., because I have no other outlet. I really don't. Again, I'm not being interviewed hardly by anybody. I don't really understand why, except, the opinion of Jan Irvin is that everybody's been sold. Everybody's sold out. They've all been approached. They've all been bought. So they won't interview people like us. So I want to go to another government website that's very important. And this is the Appomattox Courthouse. Now, when you hear courthouse, you think of a building. Courthouse actually is, well, here, let me just read. This is the frequently asked questions at the Appomattox Courthouse. This is the National Historic Park website, .gov website, NPS, in Virginia. The frequently asked questions: where's the courthouse where the surrender took place? The surrender occurred in the village of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, in a private home owned by the McLean family. In Virginia, many of the towns which were county seats were called, quote-unquote, courthouse. The building is spelled courthouse, one word, and the town is courthouse, two words, capitalized. Now, here's where we get to the interesting part. Where was the treaty signed? Where was the treaty that ended the Civil War? Oh, trick question, you see, because there was no war. It was a war, folks. Just like Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Vietnam, Korea, these weren't wars. Therefore, there's no treaties. There's just absolute destruction and subjection and takeover. These aren't wars. They don't follow the rules of war. Where was the treaty signed? Here's what the government tells you. There was no treaty signed to end the Civil War. Let me say that again, even more dramatically. Quote, there was no treaty signed to end the Civil War, because there never was a war. The surrender, this is from the website, the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse was a military surrender of an army which was surrounded. The Confederate government never surrendered. The Confederate government never surrendered, and even had it wanted to, the United States government would likely not have accepted. To do so would have legally acknowledged the existence of the Confederate States of America and would have legitimized it and given it certain legal status internationally. Treaties are between two nations, and the U.S. would never concede the legal existence of the Confederacy, even though it had a government, armies, taxes, and all the trappings of a modern government. See, now you see the picture. This was not a war for slavery in any way, shape, or form. Again, as Lincoln said, this was to preserve the Union. And how do you preserve the Union? You do not recognize or respect the fact that these states seceded from the Union, formed their own government, abandoned Congress, which means the United States is now illegitimate. Congress is illegitimate, which is why it had to go militarily through the executive as a corporation in Washington, D.C. You now understand that this whole thing was to prevent the Confederate States of America from ever establishing itself internationally as a nation. Therefore, the law of nations never applied because the Confederate States, why did we destroy our own people? Why did the North so brutally attack its brothers and cousins? Why? Because there was no law that protected. There was no law, international law, that protected that newly formed government. This is why, again, these codes had to be created, the Lieber Code, etc. How do you treat your own people when you've taken over? You keep the same government, you pretend everything's the same, but there are defeated people, and that's what we are. This is the hardest thing to explain to Americans, because American exceptionalism is so ridiculous. Patriotism is so ridiculous. How do you explain to people that you are a militarily conquered people? But under the Lieber Code, which we'll read a few articles from, it says very plainly that the government will not change. It'll appear, for all respects, to be the same thing, even though it's a militarily conquered place. And this is why you have military bases in every state. Why do you think you have federal bases? Why does the federal government have military bases in every state? Well, Article 1 of the Lieber Code says the presence of a military force in a country or in a state represents the marshals of law. That is, you're under martial law, but you're in the what's called peace, which is commerce, which is you're going with it. You're not fighting it. You're slaves. And so you're in peace. Peace, of course, is war. You're under military occupation. It's called military rule, to be exact. And martial law only happens when military order, military rule, doesn't cut it. When you wake the hell up and realize, holy crap, you soldiers of the United States wake up and realize, holy crap, I'm doing the same thing the North did to the South. I'm literally guarding and militarily conquering my own frickin' people. Until that happens, nothing's going to change. It's going to be run by this corporate structure. And there is no secession, as we've already covered that. If you haven't listened to the last shows, then you missed the fact that there is no secession. It's written in the Constitutions. For God's sake, read your constitutions before you say you're going to secede from the Union. It's not allowed by the Union. And guess what? That brings me to the end of the Civil War. But let me read this again, because I think this is probably the most important statement I've ever heard government make. There was no treaty signed to end the Civil War. The surrender at Appomattox Courthouse was military only, of an army which was surrounded. The Confederate government never surrendered, and even had it wanted to, even had it offered its surrender, the United States government would likely not have accepted, because if it accepted, it would have acknowledged that it was separate, that it was indeed a nation, and it would have had to extend to that nation all the rules of war of the international. See, this is how screwed up it is. To do so would have legally acknowledged the existence of the Confederate States of America and would have legitimized it and given it certain legal status internationally. Treaties are between two nations, and the U.S. would never concede the legal existence of the Confederacy, even though it had a government, armies, taxes, and all the trappings of a modern government. Now, does that mean that presidential proclamations were not made to end the executive orders? Because there was no war. There was no declared war by Congress. Remember, Congress was defunct. This was just a desperate corporate structure trying to retain, just like the king, trying to retain by train the Union, the kingdom, by sending troops down south. See, it's no different. No different at all. And that brings us to the proclamations that actually ended the quote-unquote Civil War as we call it. You see, these were the proclamations that defeated the original executive orders that were made by Lincoln to induce the quote-unquote Civil War, to induce the fact that troops would go into these states and subdue their property, basically. See, this is a totally different history than you've ever heard, and here it is right here on the government website. Now, reading from the archives.gov site again, this time the National Archives. This is from the last surrenders of the Civil War. I'm just going to go to the end of this. Well, let's start at the beginning and then we'll go to the end. To many Americans, the word Appomattox is synonymous with the end of the Civil War. The war, however, did not officially conclude at that tiny village west of Petersburg, Virginia. But what happened there in early April 150 years ago certainly marked the beginning of the end of the Confederacy. After the fall of Richmond, the Confederate capital, in 1865, April 2nd, officials in the Confederate government, including President Jefferson Davis, fled. The dominoes began to fall. The surrender at Appomattox took place a week later on April 9th. While it was the most significant surrender to take place during the Civil War, General Robert E. Lee, the Confederacy's most respected commander, surrendered only his army of Northern Virginia to Union General Ulysses S. Grant. Several other Confederate forces, some large units, some small, had yet to surrender before Andrew Johnson could declare that the Civil War was officially over. The Grant-Lee Agreement served not only as a signal that the South had lost the war, but also as a model for the rest of the surrenders that followed. Surrenders, folks. Dare I pull up a dictionary and actually see what the word surrender means? What does it mean that the states surrendered? To surrender, or, well, let's see. To yield to the power of another, to give or deliver up possession upon compulsion or demand, as to surrender one's person to an enemy, or to a commissioners of bankrupt, to surrender a fort or ship, etc., to yield, to give up, to resign in favor of another, to surrender the right or privilege, to surrender the place or office, to give up, to resign. In law, to yield an estate. Okay, estate and state are essentially the same word. So in law, to yield an estate. What did the states do? They yielded their lands, their tenant. They're no longer the states you think they are. As a tenant, right? That's why I always say your tenants, even if you own the land, you have a mortgage, you're a tenant. Even if you're free and clear, you're a tenant. It says so on your mortgage, on your contract. To yield to any influence, passion, or power as to surrender oneself. The act of yielding or resigning one person's or the other possession of something into the power of another. A castle to an enemy. Surrender of a right or of claims. What do we do to land? We claim. What are the states? Their claims. A yielding up or giving up. In law, the yielding of an estate by a tenant to the Lord for such purposes as are expressed by the tenant in the acts. Of course, the states are tenants. Oh, folks, we are a militarily conquered bunch of states, bunch of countries, basically. And if you don't get that, if you don't accept that because of all the propaganda you've been fed since your public education, since your birth, I can't help you. If you can't face the truth as is being reported to you by government, as written in history, which, again, and as soon as you hear these proclamations that end the Civil War, as they call it, the war, the northern aggression, the federal takeover of the states, well, you'll have no doubt, especially you, Texas, that, sorry, you are a conquered state, estate. So let's go, but I want to read the end of this real quick. It says, in the epilogue, it says, in a presidential, this is the archives.gov, in a presidential proclamation issued on April 2nd, 1866, a presidential proclamation. Does that say Congress to you? Does that have anything to do with Congress? No, because Congress never declared a war. It was not a lawful war. It wasn't a war at all. This is what I keep trying to tell you. You can call it Civil War. You can call it the Vietnam War. You can call it the Korean War. But all of these were presidential declarations of war. That is not legitimate. That's the United States, not the representatives of the 50 states. They don't give a shit about the 50 states anymore. It's the corporation of the United States is out of control. It has no control from the states. Congress has nothing to do with the states anymore. They're not there as statesmen. They give a shit about their states. Even Ron Paul, your freaking hero, the big liar that I've exposed over and over and over, he doesn't care about the state. He's part of the corporation. He's part of the landholder. He's part of the family. God, I wish people could get this. President Johnson declared, one man declared that the insurrection that had existed, so it's an insurrection. Oh, God, there goes Clint again. He's going to pull out his dictionary. Notice that the word sir is in the word surrender and insurrection. From Sergio, to rise, a rising against civil or political authority. Is that what the states did? A rising against civil or political authority? The open and active opposition of a number of persons to the execution of a law in a city or state? It's the equivalent to sedition, except that sedition expresses a less extensive rising of citizens. It differs from rebellion, for the later expresses a revolt or an attempt to overthrow government. Now listen to that, folks, because see, we call all these people who are fighting against our occupations of all these different countries out there, whether it be Iraq or, Somalia, all these different countries, we call them insurgents. They're people rising against civil or political authority of the United States. They're not the bad guys. See, it's different from rebellion. The Civil War wasn't a rebellion. It wasn't a rebellion of the southern states. It was an insurrection, and they acknowledge it here, which means that these states were trying to get out from under a political authority, which we call the United States, a corporation, a corporate structure, as we discussed in our previous shows. So a rebellion is a revolt or an attempt to overthrow government. They weren't trying to overthrow government. Nothing about the Confederacy was an overthrow of government. But to the United States, it was a stealing of United States property, land. You see? It wasn't a rebellion. To establish a different one or to place the country under another jurisdiction. It differs from mutiny as it respects the civil or political government. The Confederacy wasn't saying, hey, United States doesn't exist. It's just that we don't want to be a part of it anymore. So it respected the civil and political government, and it expected the United States to respect the Confederacy. But you see, the whole point was to never allow those southern states to form and organize, because then they'd be under the international and they'd have to respect it as a nation. How fucked up. It differs from mutiny as it respects the civil and political authority of government, whereas in mutiny is an open opposition to law in the army or navy. Insurrection is, however, used with such latitude as to comprehend either sedition or rebellion, it says. So that means, of course, by United States standards, right? Yeah. It didn't do anything. It didn't incite war. The North incited the war with the South. A rising in mass to oppose an enemy. It's more romantic. Again, that's everyone out there who is being attacked by the United States. All 55 or so countries that we've invaded, they're insurgents, and they surrender. And the United States puts a military base there. And according to the Libra Code, the presence of a military base in any country means it's conquered and under that rule. See, you don't even realize, I think, most people don't realize that between the United Kingdom, the United States, everything's taken. Everything is occupied. We're not fighting a war to preserve anything. We're fighting a war to protect our interests in other lands, other countries, other peoples, other cultures, so that we can rape and extort. That is totally different than what they portray themselves as doing. We're a army for the good. We're a global force for good. No, you're not. You're petty pirates. You're criminals. And you're occupying, just like you did back then, you're occupying everywhere in the world. How long can we stand for this, knowing the suffering that's going on? Have you seen the pictures, the media coming back from these? Have you seen what's happened to Libya? For God's sake, you had a wonderful, wonderful dictator. I hate to say that. You had this guy who said, I'm not gonna put my own father into a home until all the people in Libya have a home. I'm going to bring water to the desert. I'm going to do all these wonderful things. The people loved him. He didn't have to hide behind glass like the Pope and like the presidents do. But you know what? Let me tell you what's happening in Libya right now. What's happening in Libya? What's happened since the United States went in there and spread its fucking democracy? This was sent to me by Drew, actually. Drew's my archiver. I love the guy. You can find all our archives at not only on ucy.tv / Red Pill Sunday School, is RPSS, actually. But I also keep them, all my shows, including ones I do on other stations, at Corporation Nation Radio Archives.wordpress.com. That's Corporation Nation Radio Archives.wordpress.com. And Drew is good enough to always put my shows up there. I thank him. I'm indebted to him. This is from The Guardian. It says, migrants from West Africa being sold in Libyan slave markets. Oh, well, thank God we went into Libya to destroy the horrible, horrible oppression. Now there's slave markets in Libya. UN Migration Agency says selling of people is rife in African nation, that's Libya, that has slid into violent chaos since the overthrow of Gaddafi. West African migrants are being bought and sold openly in modern-day slave markets in Libya. Survivors have told the UN agency helping them return home. Trafficked people passing through Libya have previously reported violence, extortion, and slave labor. But the new testimony from the International Organization for Migration suggests that the trade in human beings has become so normalized that people are being traded in public. The latest reports of slave markets for migrants can be added to a long list of outrages in Libya, said Mohammed Akhtar, IOM's head of Operation of Emergencies. The situation is dire. The more IOM engages inside Libya, the more we learn that it is a vale of tears for all too many migrants. Well, thank God the United States went in there and cleaned up to allow more slavery to happen, right? Because Gaddafi was purely against that. Gaddafi wanted to bring the wonders of, I mean, God, what? How can people sit back and ignore that we caused this? Oh, those horrible countries, they do. Oh, human slavery. Oh, we did this. You are responsible. Each one of you listening, each of you individually who do nothing, who sit silent and who enjoy the benefits of being in this wonderful country. How can we live like this? How can we live like freaking we're in some utopian place when the rest of the world we're tearing apart to cause slavery? The very thing that the subject of the whole thing. To call this irony, I don't call it irony. I call it business as fucking usual. It's just business, folks. It's commerce. And commerce, of course, is exactly what they said slavery was, why they passed that original amendment that said that, and it was passed. That's the scary part. The scariest part is that it was passed. Lincoln, the House, and the Senate passed the immortality and protection of slavery in the Constitution, right? So is it any wonder that we would allow this to happen? Why aren't we going to Libya now to stop this? Why would we take out a dictator only to allow it to slip into such... The answer is clear, folks. Don't ask why. Ask, is it business as usual? Who benefits? Cui bono? It's so obvious. And I stress again, it's all on each of your heads as long as you support this thing. Now, if you're a member of a sports club, of a gym, and that gym starts doing shit that you don't like, charging you fees you don't deserve to pay, treating people like crap, what do? You cease your membership. What makes you think that you are forced to be a member and support this thing? I understand. There's this mythical, violent gun at your head that says you have to follow the laws and do all that stuff. I get it. I understand. You have a fear of men over a fear of God. And look at the results. I get it. But there's got to be a point. There's got to be, what did the fathers say? There's got to be a point where blood is shed. Not the blood of your victims, but the blood of your oppressor, right? I mean, that's what the Declaration of Independence said, right? That the people have the right to alter and change their government. Well, that only applies to a legitimate government, doesn't it? Not when you have a military force that is your government, an executive branch that runs all things, where the judicial branch has all but been placed into the Department of Justice and executive branch. So you have no third Department of Justice, which you don't need when you have an administrative system for slaves. You don't need a judicial. you don't have a judicial, by the way, in case you don't know that, because you're under the United States. You're under the corporation. There's no judicial. You tell me, is there a court in your office where you work? No, of course not. You're fired arbitrarily. In this case, you're put in prison arbitrarily. Whatever. I don't know what to tell you, folks, but let's go on. So let's read the proclamation so we can understand exactly the disposition we are in as citizens of the United States and the states. All right, here we go. Later that summer, this is back to the archives.gov site, the president declared that the insurrection in Texas was suppressed. Texas was the final holdout. The president acknowledged that, quote, adequate provisions have been made by military orders to enforce the execution of the acts of Congress, aid the civil authorities, and secure obedience to the Constitution and laws of the United States in the state of Texas. Now, does that sound like Texas is independent at all? No, and it's going to get worse, trust me. On August 20th, then, in 1866, President Johnson issued a proclamation announcing the end of the American Civil War. Oh, really? A president. Quote, and I do further proclaim that the said insurrection is at an end and that peace, order, tranquility, and civil authority now exists in and throughout the whole of the United States of America. It's funny that they only quote, and what would you expect? Government is not going to quote the bad part. It's only going to quote that part, which sounds romantic. Peace, order, tranquility, and civil authority now exists. In other words, you're under military occupation. Peace, commerce. With the proclamation of the United States officially closed, a costly, bloody, and deadly chapter in its nation's history that started at Fort Sumter several years and hundreds of thousands of lives earlier. Now, of course, more lives were taken in the Civil War than all of other wars, as I understand it. I might be wrong on that, but I've heard that combined more U.S. people of the United States living here, men, died in the Civil War than did in all the other wars combined. But don't quote me on that because I'm not sure that's accurate. but it was all to save the Union. Do you still think it was about slavery? If you do, you're an absolute fool. Do you think it was about ending slavery? You fool. No, it was not. The white persons wanted desperately, the landholders, the only ones who can hold land according to the Constitution, wanted desperately to hold their slaves. So let's go to that proclamation. And let's read the rest of it, because in August 20th, 1866, President Johnson issued a proclamation announcing the end of the Civil War. All right, let's read the rest of it. Now, we have to remember that Lincoln, by this time, was, of course, assassinated, as was feared. Who wouldn't want to kill a guy like that? Who didn't give a shit about slavery only to save the Union and signed an act to perpetuate slavery without end and without ever, as a constitutional amendment? Gee, I don't know who'd want to kill a guy like that. All right. Andrew Johnson, of course, President of the United States from 1865 to 1869, where all this shit took place, labeled as one of the worst presidents in history. Proclamation 157, declaring that peace, order, tranquility, and civil authority now exists in and throughout the whole of the United States of America. By the President of the United States of America, a proclamation, whereas by proclamations of the 15th and 19th of April, 1861, the President of the United States, in virtue of the power vested in him by the Constitution and laws, declared that the laws of the United States were opposed and the execution thereof obstructed in the states of South Carolina, etc., and Texas by combinations too powerful to be suppressed by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings or by the powers vested in the marshals by law, and by another proclamation made on the 16th day of August in the same year, in pursuance of an act of Congress approved July 13th, 1861, the inhabitants of the states, except the inhabitants of that part of the state of Virginia lying west of the Allegheny Mountains, and except also those inhabitants of such other parts of the state and the other states before named as might maintain a loyal adhesion to the Union and the Constitution, or might be from time to time occupied or controlled by forces of the United States engaged in the dispersion of insurgents. What's an insurgent? You, me, anyone who opposes the United States as a corporation ruling over us. Yeah, that's us. We were declared to be in a state of insurrection against the United States. Whereas another proclamation, 1862, issued in pursuance of the Act of Congress, approved June 7th in the same year, the insurrection was declared to be still existing in the states aforesaid, with the exception of certain specified counties, etc. And it goes on and goes on, gives that, it gives the reasons for this particular proclamation 157 declaring the end of the Civil War, essentially. And let's see. And whereas the Senate of the United States on this 25th day of July, 1861, adopted a resolution in the words following, which that the present deplorable Civil War has been forced upon the country, etc., etc., etc. You can read all about those on your own. Keeps going. Whereas. Okay. Whereas the President of the United States, by further proclamation, issued the 2nd day of April, 1866, did promulgate and declare that there no longer existed any armed resistance of misguided citizens or others to the authority of the United States in any or in all the states before mentioned, excepting only the state of Texas, the last holdout, and did, probably because it's the farthest away, and did further promulgate and declare that the laws could be sustained and enforced in the several states before mentioned, except Texas, by the proper civil authorities, state or federal, and that the people of said states, except Texas, are well and loyally disposed and have conformed or will conform in their legislation to the condition of affairs growing out of the amendment to the Constitution of the United States prohibiting slavery within the limits and jurisdiction of the United States. Now remember, we read these. They had to sign the enabling acts, they had to redo their constitutions, and they had to pledge complete, the United States is king. President is king. Constitution is king. You can't. They had to agree to the slavery, the abolishment of slavery, which meant all slaves now went into United States citizenship. And we read the enabling acts in which all public lands were given over to the United States, the same exact complaint that all the southern states had before the Civil War. Our lands are being taken by the United States. Well, since we've now conquered all the states, we're now requiring them to give up their public lands through the enabling acts. If you didn't catch that, catch the previous couple shows, and 3 shows, and that'll explain that. And did further declare in the same proclamation that it is manifest determination of the American people that no state of its own will has the right or power to go out of or separate itself from or be separated from the American Union, and that therefore each state ought to remain and constitute an integral part of the United States. Does that sound like you have the right to secede? It ever did? Oh, it's all to keep the union together, the corporation. And did further declare in the same last mentioned proclamation that the several aforementioned states, excepting Texas, had in the manner aforesaid given satisfactory evidence that they acquiesce in this sovereign and important resolution of national unity. They surrendered, acquiesce. No, they surrendered. The insurgents surrendered. This is not the history that you have been told. Whereas the President of the United States in the same proclamation did further declare that it is believed to be a fundamental principle of government that the people who have revolted and who have been overcome and subdued must either be dealt with so as to induce them voluntarily to become friends. Oh, you mean like through United States citizenship, where all men are citizens of the United States and foreigners in their states? Oh, yeah. Induce them to voluntarily become friends. Or else, that's alien friends, by the way, or else they must be held by absolute military power. Absolute military power, or devastated, so as to prevent them from ever again doing harm as enemies, which last name policy is abhorrent to humanity and to freedom, meaning franchise. Oh my God. Did you ever hear this? Did you ever read this before, folks? Voluntarily become friends, or you will be held by absolute military power and or devastated so as to prevent you from ever doing harm against the United States, against Washington, D.C., that is, as enemies. Of course, everyone's an enemy. You're all declared enemies, and we'll read that maybe next week or if we have time. Whereas the president did in the same proclamation further declare that the Constitution of the United States provides for constituent communities only as states and not as territories, dependencies, provinces, or protectorates, and further that such constituent states must necessarily be, and by the Constitution and laws of the United States are made equals and placed upon like footing as to political rights, not natural ones, immunities, dignity, and power within the several states, which they are united. That means absolutely fucking nothing. It really, I mean, come on. Come on. If under the statement that says you could be forced by absolute military power, you also tell someone or something like a state that you have political rights, immunities, dignity, and power within the several states, that you're united, does that, I mean, are you really fooled by that kind of doublespeak? 1984 doublespeak? And did further declare that the observance of political equality is a principle of right and justice. Political equality. is well calculated to encourage the people of the before named states, except Texas, to be and to become more and more constant and preserving in their renewed allegiance. To encourage by military force the people of the before named states except Texas to be and become more and more constant and preserving in their renewed allegiance. Doublespeak. Whereas the president did further declare that standing armies, military occupation, martial law, military tribunals, and the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus dangerous to public liberty, incompatible with the individual rights of the citizen, contrary to the genius and the spirit of our free institutions. Free and exhaustive of the national resources, and ought not therefore to be sanctioned or allowed except in cases of actual necessity for repelling invasion or suppressing insurrection or rebellion. Well, wait a minute. Isn't that what you said the states were doing? Oh, I love it. Standing armies, military occupation, martial law, and military tribunals, these are all the things that they did. But now we're saying, oh, that's bad. You know, it's bad for the national pocketbook. And the president did further in the same proclamations declare that the policy of government of the United States from the beginning of the insurrection is to overthrow and final suppression. What's the policy of the government of the United States, folks, from the beginning of the insurrection? In the Civil War that never ended, that never had a treaty, as we just read. It never ended, folks. This never ended. This is a proclamation that I'm reading to you. The policy of the government of the United States from the beginning of the insurrection to its overthrow and final suppression had been conducted in conformity with the principles in the last named proclamation recited. What makes you think, you know, when you say you have rights, for instance, what makes you think that those exist in any tangible form, that in any set form? The second a declaration is made, they don't exist. They just don't exist. I mean, come on. You're not free. We're not free. Whereas the president, in the said proclamation of the 13th of June, 1865, upon the grounds therein stated and therein before recited, did then and thereby proclaim and declare that the insurrection which heretofore existed in the several states before named, except Texas, was at an end and was henceforth to be so regarded. And whereas subsequently to the said second day of April 1866, the insurrection in the state of Texas, listen to this, Texas, the insurrection in the state of Texas has been completely and everywhere suppressed and ended, and the authority of the United States has been successfully and completely established in the said state of Texas, and now remains therein unresisted and undisputed. And such of the proper United States officers as have been duly commissioned within the limits of the said state are now in the undisturbed exercise of their official functions. Texas, you are under the United States. You are not whatever it is that you think you are. We're a republic. No, you're in a civil war that never ended. You cannot secede from the Union. It's all a big fucking lie. If you want to find that, by the way, again, the April 2nd, 1866 was when that declaration or whatever it's called, proclamation was created. We can read that too, and it's devastating if you just go read it. you're going to find out that everything that they teach you about your republic is bullshit. Go read it. Go read the proclamation that, as we just read, you can't dispute it. Go read it yourselves, Texas. And quit acting like you're something you're not. Whereas the laws can now be sustained and enforced in the said state of Texas by the proper civil authority. That's why there's military bases there, you fools. State or federal, and the people of the said state of Texas, like the people of other states before named, are well and loyally disposed to have conformed or will conform in their legislation to the condition of affairs growing out of the amendment of the Constitution of the United States prohibiting slavery within the limits and jurisdiction of the United States. Remember, the only difference in Texas is that the state, quote unquote, which is under military authority, kept its unappropriated public lands. It's the only difference, and that was only because the court, as we discussed, there was a precedent in court at that time. That was the only exception, had nothing to do with the coolness or greatness of Texas. And whereas all the reasons and conclusions set forth in regard to the several states therein specifically named now apply equally and in all respects to the state of Texas, as well as to the other states which had been involved in the insurrection. That's your equal footing. You're equally screwed. And whereas adequate provision has been made by military orders to enforce the execution of the acts of Congress, aid the civil authorities, and secure obedience to the Constitution and laws of the United States within the state of Texas, if a resort to military force for such purpose should at any time become necessary. Let me say that again. Your obedience is secured to the Constitution of the laws of the United States within the state of Texas and all other states equally, if a resort to military force for such purpose should at any time become necessary. You step out of line, it's going to be civil war all over again. Why? To preserve the Union. Not to preserve Texas or the people or the Republic of Texas. To preserve the fucking Union. To preserve the property of the United States conquered in war. Well, an illegitimate war, a presidential declaration of war by a corporation that's external from all states in Washington, D.C. Now, therefore, I, Andrew Johnson, President of the United States, do hereby proclaim and declare that the insurrection which heretofore existed in the state of Texas is at an end, and is to be henceforth so regarded in that state as in the other states before named, in which the said insurrection was proclaimed to be at an end by the aforesaid proclamation of the 2nd day of April, 1866. Again, pull that up. And I do further proclaim that the said insurrection is at an end, and that peace, order, tranquility, and civil authority now exist in and throughout the whole of the United States of America. Now, in testimony, done in the city of Washington, city being a municipal corporation, 20th of August, A.D., 1866, and of the independence of the United States of America, the 91st, Andrew Johnson, by the President. And, oh, look, there's William H. Seward, Secretary of State. Huh, how nice. So, look, folks, what does that last thing say? That the insurrection is at the end in the United States of America. Why? Because the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America, for all intents and purposes, never existed under international law or under the law of the United States. You see, this was not a war to end slavery at all. This was a war to keep the each franchise of a corporation. Imagine if all the McDonald's decided they wanted to be free and form their own Confederate headquarters of McDonald's. What would McDonald's do? Same thing. You see, not about slavery. Although slavery, of course, had a lot to do. I mean, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that slavery was the backbone of everything, of course. But the war itself was to preserve the Union. Now, and I want to be clear that we're all equal. Whether you're black, you're white, Chinese, wherever you are, no matter what you are, if you're a citizen of the United States, if your family has tricked you into going into that pirate cove and worshiping those false gods, you are a slave. Voluntarily so, but do you really think that makes a difference? Do you think freedom, as they define it, as franchise of the corporation, do you really think that that means anything but voluntary servitude, voluntary slavery? It doesn't, folks. And now you know the real history of the United States. Next week, we will cover a lot more stuff. Next week, we're going to go over the presidential directives and executive orders, how that came to be. And we're going to cover the inalienable aspect and discuss how we've all sold our rights to essentially the adversary, which is the United States. I hope you've enjoyed it, if that's the right word. I know it's a tough pill to swallow, but folks, the truth is always a tough pill to swallow. That's why we call it Red Pill Sunday School. Love y'all. Take care. Thanks for tuning in to UCY.tv, and we'll see you next week.